Now this particular neck region, as we have developed with initially, if you go back to this developing embryo, we have agreed to learn that at the 4th week of life, we didn't had any neck as such. So the system and the body needs to develop something which actually develops the neck or the face region. So it creates something which actually transforms this particular face and the neck region, which we normally in an adult or we are born with. That means we develop the face region, we develop this mouth, we develop this ear ossicles, chin, cheek, everything, and as well as this neck muscles, and do also get this particular skeletal structures that we have this like the bones, like head neck bones. Now the system which develops into this particular like a neck structures is coming from a conjoined thing, we call them as pharyngeal apparatus. And this particular pharyngeal apparatus is an union of 3 different components. There is a bulge component of the pharyngeal apparatus there, we call them as pharyngeal arches. And then we have some kind of grooves there, we call them as pharyngeal groove. And there is some kind of pouches also there, we call them as pharyngeal pouches. So these 3 together contributes to the neck region structures that we have, that we belong. So this is what we started with in this particular foregut regions. Initially we didn't have anything before. This region starts to transform and goes to form some kind of bulginess like this. These bulges or bumps which you are seeing here, we call them as pharyngeal arch. And in between these arches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, craniocaudally, if you count them, between them we have this particular thing on the outer side and inner side. We give the other names, like we call them as pharyngeal clefts on the ectodermal side, and endodermal side we call them as pharyngeal pouches. So all 3 together, they are constituting the developing content or developing system, we call them as pharyngeal apparatus. So this particular pharyngeal apparatus is coming up with it. Now this particular pharyngeal arch, that is purely mesodermal, that means it's a mesodermal contributions is coming in this particular pharyngeal arch there, which is this brown thing which is going in. Then we have this ectodermal side on these arches, which have got in between these arches is a depressed part, we call them as pharyngeal clefts, also known as pharyngeal grooves. And then on the endodermal side or inside the gut tube, this is the brain which is going on, and inside the gut tube which you seeing here, we have this yellow thing which is coming from the yolk sac derivatives, we call them as endodermal element, we call them as pouches or pharyngeal pouches. So each of these arch, pouch and grooves individually contributes to form this particular neck region. Now what we have to do? We have to learn what contributions coming from arches and the groove and the pouches in this future neck region that we have, that we belong. And these are all questions which may be developmental error based on questions or MCQs will be coming on. Now as we are learning this, we take one at a time and learn about. We started learning about these particular arches. Once we are done with the arches, we'll move to something like a pouches and then grooves likewise. And what they actually contribute, that we are going to memorize, because they are MCQ like a pickup areas or hotspot areas where these MCQs are commonly been flashed, and as well as we have some developmental area to cover which is important to us. Now pharyngeal arches, as we see that these are the mesodermal element predominantly making some kind of bumps like this on this particular outer side which is visible to it. And if you count them, this particular arches from craniocaudally, that means from the head to the tail region, we see that the number of the arches keeps on coming up. So from the 4th week of life it was 1, as it reaches to the 6th week of life it becomes 6, and eventually out of this particular 6 arches, number 5 disappears. So leaving into the 5 bunch of these particular elevations on the right side and the left side present, which are known as pharyngeal arches. So this particular pharyngeal arches, what they are constituting of is mesenchymal or mesodermal element. Now mesodermal and mesenchymal element is a click out here, because we learned there are kind of mesoderm which is present, which is contributing to the muscles and the bones in our bodies, which are coming from the element we call them as intra-embryonic mesoderm. Now this intra-embryonic mesoderm have got three components. We call them as paraxial mesoderm, we call them as lateral plate mesoderm, and in between we have the intermediate mesoderms. In here, this mesoderm or these mesenchymal arches or pharyngeal arches that we have is coming from two sources. One is coming from this particular area, we call them as paraxial mesoderm, and we are coming from this other thing which is known as lateral plate mesoderm, which is a normal thing. Rest of our body is contributed by these two components of intra-embryonic mesoderm. So all the muscles, bones are developed from this intra-embryonic mesoderm. Now what addition thing we have here, we have a migratory cells moves in here. We call them as neural crest cells. Now these neural crest cells are neuroectodermal cells. They migrate from the developing brain region and move into these developing arches. As they move into, they transform into mesenchymal tissues. So the pharyngeal element or pharyngeal arch, the mesoderm is out here, is coming from three different sources, which is kind of special. And if you have something special, that is exam important. So this particular mesenchyme or mesodermal element is having three components. One thing is paraxial mesoderm, second thing is lateral plate mesoderm. That is everywhere we have this, which is a part of intra-embryonic mesoderm. What addition we have here, where nowhere else we're going to find, is that neural crest cells is getting into the mesenchymal arches and transforms into the component. Now what this particular mesoderm transforms here, it transforms into two elements, skeletal element and the muscle element. That means muscles on this region and the skeletal element, that means bones and the cartilages that we have in our like a face and the neck region and as well as head region are coming from this area. Now if you break it down, if you see this particular neural crest cells transforms into viscerocranium and part of the neurocranium. How these things? We have impressions of these different pictures of different colors, things which you're seeing here. The blue shades, what you're seeing here, the parts of this neurocranium or facial skeleton, they are coming from the neural crest cell transformed variety. These are kind of special thing. So we call them as neural crest cell origin bone tissues. These are your MCQs that you see here in examinations. The red one, which is coming from this intra-embryonic mesoderm, that means which normally we come from, this like coming from paraxial mesoderm. This yellow one, little one that we are seeing here, these are the cartilage of the larynx. They are coming from the lateral plate mesoderm. The yellow and the red, they are normal thing. What abnormal thing we have here is sourcing here is NCC or neural crest cell. So these neural crest cells transforms into skeletal element like frontal bone, nasal bone, lacrimal, zygomatic, maxilla, like mandibles, part of this particular temporal bones, sphenoid bone, hyoid bone, which is a part of like the laryngeal cartilages, etc., etc. Styloid process. So these are kind of your MCQ exams, which you see here, picking up a bone in this region. Origin of this bone is coming from which kind of cells? A, B, C, D, E. None of the above or all of the above, like kind of those questions are coming in. So I would request you to remember these things so that you can answer these MCQs based on this particular development origin of the neurocranium or viscerocranium in this particular region. And this is high yield area for MCQs. Now, moving back to this particular element. So mesenchyme, this is giving rise to the bony element, skeletal element in the neck region. What else this mesenchyme transforms? It mesenchyme transforms into muscles. That means the muscles that are present in the face and the neck regions also coming from this mesodermal element. They are coming from these mostly paraxial mesoderm and the lateral plate mesoderm. And predominantly the lateral plate mesoderms, which is also contributing to the formations of the muscles in this region. So, having said that, this particular mesenchyme element we are going to talk here as we break it down into each of these individual arches. Now, what else this particular arch has? This arch is covering this mesoderm element, which is coming from three sources. Each of these arch is pierced or supplied by a nerve. The nerve which is piercing is coming from usually from this or coming from the cranial region, which are known as cranial nerve. So for each of these particular arches, we have a dedicated cranial nerve for that particular arch. And whatever the muscles that are produced by the arch has to be supplied by that cranial nerve or branch of that cranial nerves only. There are no mix up between that. That means the muscles which are coming from the first pharyngeal arch will be supplied by the cranial nerve which is present inside. The cranial nerve which are present inside the developing first pharyngeal arch is cranial nerve number 5, V. That means trigeminal. So all the muscles that are produced from the pharyngeal arch number 1 will have to be or must be supplied by branches of V or 5th cranial nerve. Likewise, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th. Alright, so we'll break it down. This is one part. Second thing, they have their own arteries. That means this region, each of these arch have got their own arteries. Like first pharyngeal arch has an artery, we call them as first pharyngeal arch artery. Second one, second pharyngeal arch artery. Third, fourth, sixth, likewise. Because 5th one, we don't have them. So we call these arteries as pharyngeal arch artery. And we name it like 1, 2, 3, 4 and 6 likewise. So they have got dedicated nerve supply for each of these arch. There are no mix up, no sharing between them. And they are also having this arterial sources. The arteries are coming from this part, we call them as aortic sac, which is developing part of this truncus arteriosus, which breaks down into these particular arches. And we get this arch like this, arch artery 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We had initially 6 arches. For each arches, we have one set of artery produced, right side and the left side, likewise supplying to it. Number 5, we lose the arch. So do we lose the artery number 5. So the 5th arch artery disappears. Now, once this developmental process is going on or partly developed or partly over, once these organs, muscles, bones, everything is developed, these arteries also transform themselves. What happens to these arteries? Either they regress partially or completely, or they contribute to some formation of some other arteries. So the fate of these arteries are kind of different than that of nerve. Nerve remains as because these are transforming or supplying the muscles. In case of the arteries, once the job is over, the job of the artery is to supply the blood. So if these organs or the muscles are developed, this job of these arteries are over. So they partially transform. Either they regress, disappear, or they transform into smaller arteries. So we will give the example that will create this particular thing more and more vivid and likewise. So 5th one of the arch artery, we lose that because we lose the artery. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 and 6 pharyngeal arch arteries. So we have to understand the fate of each of these arteries. In adult, the arch number 1 persists as maxillary artery. That's the only remnant of the first pharyngeal arch artery there. So first pharyngeal arch artery in adult, we have this particular only one branch remains in adult, we call them as maxillary artery. Second one, an even tiny branch, which is stapedial artery. Third one remains little bit more than that of 1 and 2. Third one remains as the common carotid artery and the beginning of internal carotid artery. Fourth one, this is the interesting one. Right side and left side, they have a different fate. Left side, they forms the arch of aorta or part of arch of aorta. Right side, they forms the subclavian artery. This is your MCQ questions because the 4th pharyngeal arch is exam important because of the different fate and they have a clinical significance to it. We'll talk later on about the clinical significance. So 4th pharyngeal arch is very important, rather the important amongst the fate of these 4 pharyngeal arch arteries. So left side forms this part of this arch of aorta, right side forms the right subclavian artery, or beginning part of the right proximal part of the subclavian artery. These are your exam questions, this 4th one. The MCQ are very high in the MCQ, rather super high region of this fate of the 4th pharyngeal arch. Now, sixth one forms this ductus arteriosus and this particular pulmonary arteries. These 2, 4 and 6 we see that more frequently being tested in examination. So, coming back once again, so we have these arteries for each of these arch, we have the nerve for each of these particular arches as well. The fate of the artery is different than that of fate of these nerves. Nerves remains as it is because it supplies the muscles which are produced by the arches. In case of these arteries, most of the arteries is disappearing either or transforming into something else in adult life. What we have to remember here, 1, 2, 3 is kind of like the arch arteries which remains as a structural content like this maxillary, stapedial and internal carotid or carotid arteries. The fourth one is the important. You can forget anything, but fourth one is the important for us because it makes this or frames this middle part of this arch of aorta in the left side, and right side it forms the beginning part of the subclavian artery. What do the subclavian artery do? It supplies the blood to the arm, right? It gives this brachial artery and this particular axillary artery, brachial artery eventually supplies the arm. So, these two are very important in case of the developmental fate of these arch arteries. Now, coming to these particular individual arches, move Arekta, Poretta. Coming to the fate of this each of these particular arches coming or what transforms into each of these particular arches. Now, what we have see that this particular arches is predominantly have the mesenchymal element. That means it is mesodermal thing. That means it is going to produce the bones and the muscles. That means when we are going to talk about this particular fate of these arches, either we are getting some kind of cartilage, ligament or bones, or we are going to get some kind of muscles. And in case of the muscles, rule is simple. We have to know what muscles is coming in it and the nerve supply to it will be following that. So, that's how we are going to produce. The first pharyngeal arch, these basic things is easy for us. How? It is going to give rise some cartilage or bony element, it is going to give rise kind of like a muscles and the nerves is fixed for it. For the first pharyngeal arch, the dedicated nerve will be cranial nerve number V or fifth cranial nerve, or branches of fifth cranial nerve will be supplying to it or innervating it. So, what about the muscles are coming in it? Will be developing here. Now, coming to the difficult part out here, the cartilage thing. Now, this cartilage component which is present or arising of this particular first pharyngeal arch having two components. We call them as maxillary component and the mandibular component. So, if you remember the name, next thing is easy. So, if you see this cartilage is going to make two elements. One is the maxillary element and other is this one which is known as the mandibular element. The mandibular element is going to produce the mandible. That is the easy thing. Maxillary element is going to produce the maxilla, the cheekbone. That is the easy. What difficult we have? The fate, how these things are coming. That is not only the thing, maxilla and mandible is developing from first pharyngeal arch. There is some tricky element also developing from the first pharyngeal arch. So, we break it down and slowly learn about this particular thing. Cartilage element first. Maxillary process going to bring down this particular formations of the cheekbone maxilla. Along with the cheekbone maxilla, we have the zygomatic process which is also contributed or formed by this particular maxillary process over here. Mandibular process has a special name. We call them as Meckel's cartilage. This is MCQ commonly been asked about this Meckel's cartilage. Like Meckel's cartilage is coming from which pharyngeal arch? They pick up this particular word very commonly rather than mandibular process. So, Meckel's cartilage I will recommend you to memorize instead of this particular cartilage. So, these two will be breaking down into something else. Now, next part is that this muscles, whatever the muscles of mastication we have, that is coming from the first pharyngeal arch. Muscle of mastications are supplied by the branches of V or fifth cranial nerve. So, we have this muscle of mastication which is coming here is supplied from this cranial nerve number 5. Second thing is that apart from that we have some muscles which are coming from this neck region, like we have the neck muscle which is lying in the floor of the mouth. We call them as Mylohyoid muscle. We call them as anterior belly of digastric muscles. So, these two muscles are also coming from the first pharyngeal arch. Now, out of these two or out of these three, I will emphasize on two name of the two muscles. out here. One is muscle of mastication. And number 2 is anterior belly of digastric. So these two are important because MCQ reasons. Now anterior belly of digastric we have seen in dissection. There another belly of digastric is there. We call them as posterior belly of digastric. Now this anterior belly of digastric and posterior belly of digastric, they are two different muscles and coming from two different sources. But eventually they shake hand, the tendons of them, and united together and appears as a single muscle with a shared common belly. So that's why during examination this is a very high area. So anterior belly of digastric has a nerve supply which is coming from fifth cranial nerve, whereas posterior belly of digastric is sourced somewhere else. It is coming from the second pharyngeal arch, and as it is coming from second pharyngeal arch, it is not supplied by the V, it is supplied by the cranial nerve number 7, which is a dedicated nerve for the second pharyngeal arch. Am I clear? So that's why this is the rationale of asking or memorizing of anterior belly of digastric muscle nerve supply, likewise the posterior belly of nerve supply. And invariably, if you are given an exam tag to the anterior belly of digastric, there will be question following on the developmental source of it and the developmental source of the posterior belly. And they will be asking you, explain why this anterior belly is supplied by this fifth cranial nerve, whereas the posterior belly is supplied by seventh cranial nerve or branch of it. Explain why kind of question may be coming in this theory exam or maybe in the exam which is OSPE exam as well. So these are the two things that you have to keep in mind regard to it. So this muscle which are coming for it. Now coming to this particular mandibular or Meckel's cartilage, which we are going to mention. Now this Meckel's cartilage, which is known as mandibular process. So easy part is that this particular cartilage, which is known as mandibular cartilage. Now mandibular cartilage have got three components. We have this ventral component, we have a dorsal component, and we have an intermediate component. Now this particular ventral component of this mandibular cartilage develops into the mandible. This middle portion of this cartilage disappears. It creates a ligament. So this part is making some kind of ligament. The distal part creates another two cartilage or muscles, bones here. We call them as ear ossicles. So we have three tiny ear bones are there. We call them as ossicles. So we have ossicles which is present in here. We call them as Malleus and Incus. So out of these three ear ossicles, we have two of them are produced from the mandibular cartilage, and along with that we have a middle portion which is transforming into the ligaments, and the distal part is going to pick or going to make this mandible proper. So this is a tricky part of this fate of the cartilage of this first pharyngeal arch. So we emphasize on this part of these mandible formations. So this is the ventral part of the Meckel's cartilage. This is the distal part. The distal part creates the ear ossicles which is present. We have this Malleus and we have the Incus. So Malleus and Incus is present in the middle ear. They are coming from the distal part of the Meckel's cartilage. The proximal part creates this particular cartilage into mandible. The in-between part, which disappears mostly, creates some ligament. The ligament which call them as ligament of Malleus and sphenomandibular ligament. If you cannot remember them, this ligament part, let go. Remember this mandible and Malleus and Incus part first. Then some ligaments which is related to the middle ear and as well as the sphenomandibular regions which is coming from. Maxillary process, forming this particular maxilla, easy part, zygomatic bone, and little bit of this squamous part of the temporal bone is also coming from it. This is not important, I would say, maxillary process, but this mandibular process, also known as Meckel's carticulum, is super important. So you emphasize, memorize this. If you have enough space left on your brain, then learn about maxillary process. This is about the cartilage fate of the first pharyngeal arch. So this is a difficult thing that we have in this region. First pharyngeal arch, fate of this mesenchyme in terms of cartilage formation. And apart from that, we agreed to remember one thing about muscles. Muscles of mastication, we know the names of it, and anterior belly of digastric is developed from first pharyngeal arch. Other than this, Mylohyoid, Tensor Tympani, Tensor Palatini, they are also coming from it. But at the undergrad level, we cannot memorize all these things, but we will pick up this particular thing at least first, mastication and anterior belly of digastric. Now coming to the second arch, we have the second arch which is coming from here as well. So which is known as arch number 2. So arch number 2 also the same principle, cartilage, muscles and the nerves. Nerves for this second arch derivative is coming from cranial nerve 7. So whatever the muscles are produced by this particular second arch will be supplied by the cranial nerve number 7. So the second muscles which are coming from the second arch, we call them as muscle of facial expression. That means all the muscles of facial expression by this particular second pharyngeal arch. In addition to that, we have this posterior belly of digastric. It is sourced from the second pharyngeal arch. So it is produced by this second arch, which is making in here muscle of facial expression and second belly or posterior belly of digastric. The nerve supply to it will be all facial nerve or branch of facial nerve. That is the easy part of it. So this is easy part of these muscles and this posterior belly of digastric and facial nerve to it. The cartilage which is coming from here is easy. We have this bone out here, we known as hyoid bone. The upper half of hyoid bone is produced from it, and we are left with one ear ossicles, which is stapes. So this stapes is produced from the second pharyngeal arch. So stapes, which is another ear ossicle, and the upper half of this bone, we call them as hyoid. Upper half of the hyoid is produced from this, all the muscles of the facial expression, and posterior belly of digastric is coming from this arch. Nerve supply to these muscles will be all facial nerve. And this explains why this particular anterior belly is supplied by the V and why this particular second belly or posterior belly of digastric is supplied by the 7th cranial nerve. So this is kind of exam question. Third one, or third pharyngeal arch, is even more easier. So the third pharyngeal arch is left with the cartilage part develops the lower part of the hyoid bone. So hyoid bone upper part is coming from second pharyngeal arch, lower part is coming from the third pharyngeal arch. Nerve supply, which will be the muscles that is present or derived from here, will be supplied by the cranial nerve number 9 or glossopharyngeal. And good thing is that we have only one muscle is produced for it. We call this muscle as stylopharyngeus. It's coming from the styloid process and ending into pharynx. So this only one muscle is produced from it, and nerve supply to it is coming from glossopharyngeal nerve. It's a muscle of pharynx. So all the muscles of the pharynx are supplied by the cranial nerve number 10 except one. This is the exception of here. And again, this is very high yield exam MCQs. So stylopharyngeus source from the third pharyngeal arch and nerve supply to it is glossopharyngeal is super important. Is again your very important MCQ that you need to prepare. Coming to the 4th and the 6th. Then again the same rule, but again these are easy for us. 4th and the 6th, the cartilage which is produced from here is cartilages of the larynx or voice box. So all the larynx cartilages out here is produced by contributed together from the 4th pharyngeal arch and the 6th pharyngeal arches. Right? The muscles which are produced from the 4th is going to contribute the formation of the muscles of the pharynx. And the muscles which are produced from the 6th pharyngeal arch is going to produce the muscle of the larynx. So muscles of the larynx and muscles of the pharynx and the laryngeal cartilages are together coming from the 4th pharyngeal arches. and they are likewise supplied by a cranial nerve number 10. Now 10 is the vagus nerve. Now vagus nerve have got two divisions out here. We call them a superior laryngeal division and inferior laryngeal division. So these particular nerves supply to this particular fourth pharyngeal arch is coming from the superior laryngeal nerve of vagus. The sixth pharyngeal arch muscles are supplied by the recurrent laryngeal branch of the same 10th or vagus cranial nerve. So the dedicated nerve for this particular fourth and sixth is number 10. But this number 10 splits the load into two different branches. One is superior laryngeal branch, other one is inferior laryngeal nerve. Inferior laryngeal nerve supplies the larynx. So we call them as a recurrent laryngeal branch. So the recurrent laryngeal branch, which is supplying the muscles of the larynx, which is produced by the pharyngeal arch or mesenchyme on the pharyngeal arch number 6. This mesenchyme of this particular pharyngeal arch number 4 is contributing to the muscle of the pharynx. We have the names of the muscles like constrictor muscles like this. So this particular constrictor muscles of the pharynx is produced by the pharyngeal arch number 4 and supplied by the branch of the superior laryngeal branch of vagus, which is supplied for it. Except something out there, we are not complicating it right now. So these are the fates of this particular 4 arches, cartilages and muscles over here. So if you summarize this thing together, this thing what you have to keep in mind, and this chart is your MCQ chart. You can pick up any point from here, any source, and ask you about, tell me about the source or tell me about this particular cells which are producing in here. So this is what you have to keep in mind regarding and emphasizing on the pharyngeal arch number 1, which has got like cartilage part of it, has got two components. We call them as mandibular and maxillary process. The mandibular cartilage part, we call them as Meckel's cartilage. You remember that particular name. And Meckel's cartilage develops into the ear ossicles and the mandible. That's what you have to keep in mind. The rest thing is, this is what you have to keep in mind. Regard to the summary of the things about the fate of the pharyngeal arches. So pharyngeal arches in the neck region contributes to the formations of the muscles, the osseous thing, the bones and the cartilage and ligaments likewise into these regions. So these are the fates of this summary of the things which is yielding into future of this particular pharyngeal arches. Other than this, we have the artery. We call them as pharyngeal arch artery. Number 5 never existed. Number 1 and 2 tiny contributions. Number 3 is also contributing some significant, but number 4 is the important. Number 4 is contributing right side different, left side different. Right side making this artery, we call them as subclavian artery, which is going to serve this right side of the arm. And left side is from the arch of aorta, which is contributing the middle part of it, and it has got huge clinical importance on it. So coming from this particular arches, we have some developmental defects. I would just like to see it. Some of the diseases, we call this as a variety, we call them as agnathia. That means the mandible is not there in this individual. So if the mandible is not there, that means it is a first arch derivative error. That means the Meckel's cartilage, which is going to have this mandible form, is not there at all. So that individual is born with no mouth cavity proper as such. Even it is there, it is collapsible mouth or open mouth or absence of the jawbone there. So these are the things we call them as extreme syndrome or first arch syndrome. This is one variety or extreme variety of. Other than these, we have a disease we call them as Streicher-Collins syndrome, which is also having an impact of this losing of some chromosomes, where we see that the individuals do not have ear ossicles. Number 2 of the ear ossicles are developed from here, Incus and Malleus. They are not there. And as well as they have this jaw underdeveloped, micronathia. This jaw is little bit there. So this individual has a hearing problem because the ear ossicles are not there. We call this ear as conductive ear deafness. That means sound is not conducted. Second thing, absence of this or hypoplasia of the mandible likewise. So these are the things that is related to it. You do not have to remember, just like want to relate the thing. Second thing, we are moving into the part of moving into other fates. Second element of the pharyngeal apparatus. We call them as pharyngeal pouches. So likewise the pharyngeal arches, we have these pharyngeal pouches. Pouches is on the inner side or endodermal side, and if you count the numbers of it craniocaudally, there are 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of these particular pouches transforms into some soft tissue structures that is coming in here, and all of them are your exam questions because they are really important. You will see that. So we take this particular 1, 2, 3, 4 likewise and see that what things happens here. So this particular pharyngeal pouch number 1. So this is pharyngeal pouch number 1. So this particular pharyngeal pouch number 1, you see that this is having some kind of dilated part over here, and this is a narrow constricted part. So if you zoom that, you will see that this part is dilated and this part is narrow. So this narrow part forms a tube and this dilated part forms a chamber. So fate of this first pharyngeal pouch, this face of the first pharyngeal pouch, this dilated part which looks like a trumpet forms the middle ear cavity, and this narrow part which forms a tube, we call this tube as auditory tube, also known as Eustachian tube. This is also your exam MCQs. So fate of this first pharyngeal arch or auditory tube is commonly or produced from which element of pharyngeal apparatus likewise. So this auditory tube formation is coming from this first pharyngeal pouch with the tube part, the dilated part which is forming to give rise the middle ear cavity. From this particular first pharyngeal arch, we are moving to the second pharyngeal pouch. This is easy. Second pharyngeal pouch is this one. It creates a cavity, and this particular cavity creates a bed. We call them as tonsillar bed. So this particular second pharyngeal pouch creates a cavity which creates a bed. We call them as tonsillar bed. Into this tonsillar bed, lymphoid tissues get in, aggregate there, create the tonsil. So fate of the second pharyngeal pouch is easy. It forms the tonsillar bed into which the tonsil develops. But again, tonsil is not formed by the second pharyngeal arch or second pharyngeal pouch. It creates the bed. That means where the tonsil will be produced, that area is produced by it. It's not forming the tonsil itself. Tonsil is a lymphoid tissue coming from the mesodermal element. Then this is endodermal element. So this is a catch thing that you keep in mind. So it forms the tonsil, we call this tonsil palatine tonsil, which gets into this particular bed. The bed part is produced by the second pharyngeal pouch. The third one and the fourth one of these pouches, these are the important or rather super important. You will see that. So you have to pay attention in here because these two are your exam questions in theory and as well as these are MCQ questions. Now this third pharyngeal pouch is there. This one is the third one. This one is the fourth one. Both of them develops into or splits into two parts. You see that this one take first, you have got yellow part and downside we have the red part. We call them as wing. It looks like a butterfly wing. We call them as wing. We call them as ventral wing and dorsal wing. So this yellow part which you're seeing here is third pharyngeal pouch develops into a gland we call them as parathyroid gland. The lower one, the red one, develops into another tissue, we call them as thymus, which is an lymphoid organ. So, the third pharyngeal pouch develops into two things. One is an endocrine element, we call them as parathyroid gland. And other thing develops here is a lymphoid organ or must have lymphoid organ. If this thymus is not developed, we are kind of like lost. We'll see why. This lower part develops into thymus and this one forms into the parathyroid gland. Now, parathyroid is a gland which is endocrine gland. So, PTH, parathyroid gland are of two types. We call them as superior parathyroid gland. They are two in number. We have inferior parathyroid gland. They are also two in number. So the superior parathyroid gland develops from different sources and inferior parathyroid develops from different sources. So this inferior parathyroid gland develops from the pouch number 3 and the superior one develops from pouch number 4. And this is what you have to keep in mind. This is super important MCQ region. Alright. So this third and the fourth pharyngeal pouches is the thing that we are going to deal with. This is a difficult thing. We have to memorize a lot about this. So third pharyngeal pouch has got two parts. One is ventral part and is dorsal part. One part which is dorsal, which is larger, ventral one smaller. Smaller one develops into a lymphoid or develops into a endocrine organ. We call them as parathyroid gland. And parathyroid gland are of two types, superior and inferior. The third one develops into the inferior parathyroid gland. And the red one, which is going down, creates a gland. We call them as thymus. Thymus is a must-have lymphoid organ. If we do not have the thymus, our lymphoid system was not developed properly, leading into lymphoid deficiency, leading into absence of immune system functions. That means we will be born and every single day will have some kind of infections, acute, passive, chronic, etc., etc. So this is the important endocrine or lymphoid organ that is coming from this region. We call them as third pharyngeal pouch. Clear? So third pharyngeal pouch, once again, have got two parts, dorsal part, ventral part. Ventral one, this red one, develops into thymus. What is thymus? This thymus is a lymphoid organ. The dorsal one develops into an endocrine gland. Name of the gland, parathyroid gland. There are two types of parathyroid gland, superior and inferior. This third pouch develops into a gland, parathyroid gland, which is inferior parathyroid gland. That's what you have to memorize at the point right now. Now, moving into fourth pouch. Fourth pharyngeal pouch also have got same thing. We has the ventral part and the dorsal part. So this ventral part out here is yellow and the dorsal one which is out here is the blue one. So again, this yellow part which is ventral part develops into another parathyroid gland. Now this parathyroid gland is superior parathyroid gland. And this blue one which is known as the ventral part of this fourth pharyngeal arch or this lower part, we call them as ultimobranchial body. So this ultimobranchial body, which is this green, yellow, what color? Blue color. What blue color develops into? It moves into the substance of developing thyroid. And within the thyroid, they create a special kind of element. We call them as C cells. And these C cells settle down around the follicles of the thyroid. We call them as parafollicular C cells. Now, these parafollicular C cells produce a hormone, which is known as calcitonin. So, you see the importance of this region 4 and 3 because it creates a number of these hormones which is produced from here, and if you do not have them, we are kind of, you understand what you mean. So, this is what we are coming here. So, regard to this particular thing, third and the fourth, we know what develops from what. Now, this tricky part. Now, this particular third guy, which is known as the third pharyngeal pouch. Now, what happens to the third pharyngeal pouch is that this third pharyngeal pouch cells or these elements are very super adventurous people. They start to migrate. They are adventurous. Once the class is over, they pack up the bags and run, kind of guy. And they never know where they're going to stop. So, what happens to this element is that we have a migratory tendency of the third pharyngeal pouch derivative. We call them as migrations of the thymus and inferior parathyroid gland. You see that the thymus, we see that present in the thorax region, and it started from developing in the neck region. Where in the thorax, in the superior mediastinum, it is used to have a thymus present in the superior part of the mediastinum. You see that in the chest, and it developed from the neck. You see how much of travel it had made normally. So this is known as a migration of the parafollicular cell, migrations of this third pharyngeal pouch derivative. Likewise this. So this particular element, third pharyngeal pouch, develops into this particular element, parathyroid gland and this thymus. The thymus moves down into and settles down into the part we call them as thorax, superior mediastinum or anterior part of the superior mediastinum, and it settles down there. What happens to this particular other parathyroid? It goes down below this one and settles down into bottom part of this particular thymus thyroid gland. So this particular third one becomes the lower one or inferior one, That's why it is known as inferior parathyroid gland. And this one, fourth one, is coming from the fourth pharyngeal pouch, which is present in here, remains there, stays there, it becomes the superior parathyroid gland. So, this migration of this particular third pouch is very important. Now, this is what we are saying, it migrates successfully, settles down into the thorax, is fine. If it is losing the track where it should be going, it can be anywhere in the neck region. That's why this superior parathyroid gland can be anywhere in the neck region. So, if you are going to deal with any neck structures, you have to make sure that you are not dealing with any tiny object which is known as the superior parathyroid gland, because it can be in the neck region, it can be on the side of the neck region, it can be in the chest region, and as well as likewise anywhere. You name the place, it can be anywhere. So, that is why there is a migration hazard is there. We call them as migration error or migration problem will be there in case of this superior parathyroid gland and inferior parathyroid gland, and out of that inferior parathyroid gland is more prone to have in abnormal positions because it migrates. So, this is what we have to keep in mind regard to this particular pouches. So, first pharyngeal pouch yields into the cavity of the middle ear and the eustachian tube. Second one, tonsillar bed. Third and fourth, tricky one. Third one, inferior parathyroid gland and thymus. Fourth one, superior parathyroid gland and ultimobranchial body, which becomes the parafollicular C cells eventually there. So, this is what we call them as ectopic position of the thymic tissue and ectopic positions of the parathyroid. This is what we are explaining beforehand, because the fate of the third pharyngeal pouches is there because they are adventurous people, moves to different places than where they are produced. As they are adventuring or venturing on something, something can go wrong, they can lose the track and move to anywhere in the neck region, chest region likewise, and settle down into abnormal positions. So, they are having a prone to have abnormal positions. So, explain why thymic tissue are seen in the neck region rather than the mediastinum region. Explain why inferior thyroid gland is present between the developing carotid arteries or in any neck structure rather than this thymus. So, normally what happens, this particular superior and inferior parathyroid gland, they settle into this butterfly shaped gland, we call them as thyroid gland. On the posterior side of the thyroid, they tuck in. So, that is why they are known as superior and inferior parathyroid glands. So, this particular parathyroid, this should be normal place where they should be found. Other than this, the inferior parathyroid gland, as I am saying, mischievous guy, could be anywhere.